The yellow school bus pulled up to Lincoln Elementary with a loud screech of its brakes. Children poured out laughing and chatting, but one small girl stayed behind, waiting until everyone else had left. 10-year-old Lucia carefully stepped down from the bus, clutching a worn backpack that had clearly seen better days. Her father Diego had dropped her off at the bus stop that morning with an encouraging smile, but she could see the worry in his eyes. This was her third school in 2 years, and they both hoped this time would be different. Diego had finally found steady work as a night janitor at the school, which meant Lucia could attend for free. It was a blessing they couldn't afford to lose. Walking through the front doors, Lucia noticed how bright and clean everything looked. The hallways were wide with colorful artwork hanging on the walls. Students walked confidently in groups, their backpacks and clothes looking new and expensive. She looked down at her own outfit, a clean but faded dress that her grandmother had sewn from leftover fabric, and shoes that were a size too big because they were on clearance. The main office was busy with parents signing papers and teachers rushing around with coffee cups. Lucia approached the front desk where a woman with perfectly styled hair was typing on a computer. "Excuse me," Lucia said quietly. "I'm the new student. My name is Lucia Rivera." The secretary looked up and smiled, though her eyes quickly took in Lucia's appearance. "Oh yes, you're Diego's daughter, right? The new janitor?" Lucia nodded, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. She noticed how the secretary's voice had changed slightly, becoming a bit more formal and distant. "Let me get your schedule and find someone to show you around," the secretary said, shuffling through papers. "Mrs. Patterson, could you help this young lady find her classroom?" Mrs. Patterson, a teacher who had been standing nearby, turned around. She was middle-aged with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her smile seemed forced as she looked Lucia up and down. "Of course," Mrs. Patterson said. "Come along, dear. Try to keep up." As they walked down the hallway, Mrs. Patterson pointed out different rooms but didn't seem very interested in making conversation. Other teachers they passed would glance at Lucia with curious expressions, and she could hear whispers following behind them. "That's the janitor's daughter," someone murmured. "Poor thing," another voice said. "Hope she can keep up with our standards here." Lucia pretended not to hear, but each comment felt like a small sting. She had faced this before at other schools, but it never got easier. People always seemed to think that because her father cleaned buildings, she must not be as smart or capable as other children. Her first period classroom was bright and welcoming, with inspirational posters covering the walls. The teacher, Mr. Wilson, seemed genuinely kind as he introduced her to the class. "Everyone, we have a new student joining us today. This is Lucia Rivera. I hope you'll all make her feel welcome." Some students smiled and waved, but others just stared. Lucia found an empty seat in the middle of the room and tried to focus on the math lesson. She was relieved to discover that the material was actually easier than what she had been learning at her previous school. When Mr. Wilson called on her to solve a problem on the board, she answered correctly without hesitation. "Very good, Lucia," Mr. Wilson said with genuine praise. "I can tell you're going to do well in this class." But at lunch, things became more complicated. The cafeteria was enormous and noisy, filled with round tables where students sat in established groups. Lucia got her free lunch, a fact that required her to show a special card that practically announced her family's financial situation to everyone nearby. She found an empty table in the corner and ate quietly, watching the social dynamics around her. The popular kids sat near the windows, their lunch bags filled with name-brand snacks and drinks. Another group of students who seemed more studious sat together discussing homework. Where did she fit in? "Hey, are you new?" a friendly voice asked. Lucia looked up to see a girl about her age with curly red hair and freckles. She was carrying a lunch tray and had a warm smile. "Yes, I just started today. I'm Lucia." "I'm Rose," the girl said, sitting down across from her. "Mind if I eat with you? My usual lunch buddies are all absent today with the flu." For the first time that day, Lucia felt herself relax. Rose chatted easily about teachers, classes, and school events. She didn't ask nosy questions about Lucia's background or make comments about her clothes. But their conversation was interrupted when a group of older students walked by their table. One of them, a boy with expensive sneakers, looked at Lucia's free lunch tray and smirked. "Great, another charity case," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "I hope your dad doesn't steal anything while he's cleaning our classrooms." Lucia's face burned with embarrassment and anger. Rose looked shocked and started to say something, but the boy and his friends had already moved on, laughing. "Don't listen to him," Rose said quickly. "Trevor thinks he's better than everyone because his parents have money. Most of us think he's just a jerk, but the damage was done." Lucia could feel eyes on her from around the cafeteria. The whispers had started again, and she knew that by the end of the day, everyone would know she was the janitor's daughter. The afternoon brought music class, which was held in a beautiful room with tall windows and a grand piano in the center. Musical instruments lined the walls, and Lucia felt drawn to a violin case sitting on a shelf. Her fingers tingled with muscle memory. Mrs. Henderson, the music teacher, was a dramatic woman who gestured broadly when she spoke. She had perfectly styled blonde hair and wore jewelry that caught the light when she moved. "Music is the language of the soul," Mrs. Henderson announced to the class. "It speaks to something deep within us that words cannot touch." She walked around the room asking students about their musical experiences. Some mentioned piano lessons. Others talked about singing in church choirs or playing guitar. When she reached Lucia, Mrs. Henderson's expression subtly shifted. It was the same look Lucia had seen all day, polite but dismissive, as if she didn't expect much. "And what about you, dear? Do you have any musical background?" Lucia hesitated. She had learned not to share too much about herself at new schools, knowing it often led to disappointment or disbelief, but something about being in this room filled with instruments made her brave. "I play violin," she said quietly. Mrs. Henderson raised an eyebrow, and Lucia caught the skeptical expression that flashed across her face before she smiled artificially. "How wonderful," Mrs. Henderson said in a tone that suggested she didn't believe it at all. "And how long have you been playing?" "About 4 years," Lucia answered honestly. She could see the disbelief growing on Mrs. Henderson's face. Other students began to whisper among themselves, and she caught fragments of their conversations. "Yeah, right," someone muttered. "She's probably lying to seem interesting," another voice said. Mrs. Henderson tapped her fingers on her clipboard, clearly trying to decide how to handle what she obviously considered a fabrication. Behind her back, some of the other students were rolling their eyes or making faces. "Well," Mrs. Henderson said finally, "perhaps we'll have an opportunity to hear you play sometime." The way she said it made Lucia's stomach drop. It wasn't an invitation, it was a threat. She could tell that Mrs. Henderson thought she was lying, and the teacher was already planning something to prove it. As the bell rang and students filed out of the music room, Lucia overheard Mrs. Henderson talking to another teacher in the hallway. "Can you believe it? The janitor's daughter claims she plays violin. These kids will say anything for attention. Maybe we should give her a chance to prove it." The other teacher replied with a slight laugh. "Might teach her a lesson about honesty." Lucia's heart sank as she realized what was happening. She had seen this before at other schools. Teachers who decided she was lying about her abilities because of her family's situation. They never believed that someone like her could have real talents or skills. Walking to her next class, she thought about the violin hidden in her bedroom closet at home. It was old and had some scratches, but it had been a gift from her former music teacher when they couldn't afford lessons anymore. She practiced every night after finishing her homework, playing softly so as not to disturb the neighbors in their small apartment, but she had learned that sometimes it was better to keep her talents hidden rather than face the disbelief and mockery that often followed. Maybe she should have just stayed quiet in music class. As the school day ended and she walked toward the bus, Lucia saw her father through a window. Diego was setting up his cleaning cart in the hallway, preparing for his night shift. He waved at her with a proud smile, and she waved back, trying to hide her troubled expression. She loved her father and was proud of his hard work, but she wished the world could see past his job title to recognize the intelligent, caring man he was, just like she wished they could see past her circumstances to the person she really was inside. The bus ride home was quiet, and Lucia stared out the window, wondering if Lincoln Elementary would be different from her previous schools, or if she was destined to always be seen as just the janitor's daughter, rather than simply Lucia, a girl with her own dreams, talents, and potential. The teacher's lounge at Lincoln Elementary buzzed with conversation during the lunch break. Mrs. Henderson sat at the small round table with 3 other teachers, stirring her coffee while shaking her head in disbelief. "I'm telling you, the girl looked me straight in the eye and claimed she's been playing violin for 4 years. Mrs. Henderson said, her voice carrying across the room. 4 years. Can you imagine? Mrs. Patterson, who had shown Lucia around on her first day, leaned forward with interest. These kids will say anything to get attention. It's really quite sad when you think about it. What bothers me most is the lying, added Mr. Brooks, the 5th grade teacher who had heard about the incident secondhand. If we let students get away with making up stories about their abilities, where does it end? Mrs. Chen, the art teacher, nodded in agreement while unwrapping her sandwich. I had a similar situation last year. A student claimed he had been taking private art lessons, but his work was clearly at a beginner level. Turned out his family couldn't even afford basic school supplies. Mrs. Henderson took another sip of her coffee and got that look in her eyes that the other teachers recognized. It was the same expression she wore when she was planning one of her elaborate music performances for school events. You know what? I think we should give young Lucia exactly what she's asking for, Mrs. Henderson said slowly. She wants to claim she can play violin. Let's provide her with the opportunity to demonstrate her skills. The other teachers exchanged glances, immediately understanding where this was heading. What did you have in mind? Mrs. Patterson asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. Well, Mrs. Henderson said, setting down her coffee cup with a decisive clink. We have the monthly faculty meeting next Thursday. Principal Johnson is always encouraging us to showcase student achievements. What if we invited little Lucia to perform for everyone? Mr. Brooks chuckled. That's brilliant. She'll either have to admit she was lying, or she'll try to play and embarrass herself completely. Either way, Mrs. Chen added, it'll be a good lesson about the importance of honesty. Mrs. Henderson's eyes lit up with growing enthusiasm, and we could invite some of the parent volunteers who help with school events. You know, Mrs. Williams from the PTA and Mr. Garcia who runs the fundraising committee. They're always interested in hearing about talented students. The 4 teachers spent the next several minutes planning their showcase with the kind of detail usually reserved for important school events. They discussed borrowing the school's best violin from the music room, setting up a small performance area in the faculty lounge, and making sure everyone would be there to witness what they expected to be Lucia's public humiliation. I'll make the announcement this afternoon, Mrs. Henderson decided. I'll frame it as giving every student a chance to shine, regardless of their background. That way, no one can accuse us of being unfair. Meanwhile, Lucia was having lunch with Rose, who had quickly become her first real friend at Lincoln Elementary. They sat at their usual corner table, sharing stories about their morning classes. Mrs. Peterson gave us the hardest math quiz today, Rose was saying between bites of her apple. But you probably did fine. You're like super smart at math. Lucia smiled, feeling grateful for Rose's friendship. It wasn't too bad. The problems were similar to ones I did at my old school. Their conversation was interrupted when Mrs. Henderson approached their table with an overly bright smile. Several other teachers lingered nearby, pretending to be engaged in their own conversations, but obviously listening. Lucia, dear, Mrs. Henderson said in a voice that carried clearly across the cafeteria. I have some exciting news for you. Lucia looked up nervously, her stomach already beginning to twist with anxiety. There was something about Mrs. Henderson's tone that didn't feel right. As you know, our school believes in celebrating all of our students' talents, Mrs. Henderson continued, her words carefully chosen for maximum impact. I've been thinking about what you shared in music class about your violin experience. Rose looked between Lucia and Mrs. Henderson with growing concern. She could sense the tension in the air, even if she couldn't identify its source. I've arranged for you to perform at our monthly faculty meeting next Thursday, Mrs. Henderson announced loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. All of our teachers will be there, plus some special guests from the parent community. It'll be a wonderful opportunity to showcase your abilities. The color drained from Lucia's face. She could feel the eyes of other students turning toward their table, and she heard the whispers starting immediately. Is she really going to play violin for the teachers? Someone asked. I bet she can't even hold one properly. Another student giggled. Mrs. Henderson continued her performance, clearly enjoying the attention she was drawing. I know you must be excited about the chance to share your musical gifts with everyone. The meeting is at 3:30, right after school hours. Lucia's mouth felt dry as she tried to process what was happening. This wasn't an opportunity. It was a trap. She could see it in Mrs. Henderson's eyes, hear it in the artificial sweetness of her voice. I don't know if I should. Lucia began quietly. Nonsense, Mrs. Henderson interrupted. Talent like yours shouldn't be hidden. I've already made all the arrangements. Principal Johnson is very excited to hear you play. As Mrs. Henderson walked away with a satisfied smile, Rose reached across the table and squeezed Lucia's hand. Hey, are you okay? You look really pale, Rose whispered. Lucia stared down at her lunch tray, her appetite completely gone. She doesn't believe I can play, she said quietly. None of them do. They think I'm lying. But you're not lying, right? Rose asked, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. Lucia looked up at her friend, seeing doubt beginning to creep into Rose's expression too. Even Rose, who had been kind to her from the beginning, was starting to question her story. The rest of the lunch period passed in a blur. Word spread quickly through the school that the new girl, the janitor's daughter, was going to perform violin for all the teachers. Some students seemed genuinely curious, but others were clearly expecting entertainment of a different kind. During afternoon classes, Lucia found it impossible to concentrate. Teachers seemed to be watching her more closely, and she caught several meaningful glances exchanged between adults in the hallways. When the final bell rang, Lucia walked slowly toward the exit, dreading what awaited her at home. How could she explain this situation to her father? Diego had been so proud when she told him about her first day at the new school. He believed this place would be different, that the teachers would give her a fair chance. As she passed by the janitor's closet, she saw her father inside, organizing cleaning supplies for his evening shift. He looked up with his usual warm smile when he noticed her in the doorway. Mija, how was your day? Diego asked, setting down a mop to give her his full attention. Lucia forced a smile, not wanting to worry him. It was fine, Papa. I made a friend named Rose. That's wonderful, Diego said, his face lighting up with genuine happiness. I knew this school would be good for you. The teachers here seem very professional. If only he knew what those professional teachers were actually planning. Lucia thought sadly. That evening, Lucia sat in her small bedroom, staring at the violin case tucked behind her desk. The instrument inside represented years of practice, countless hours of dedication, and dreams that felt increasingly impossible to achieve. She remembered her former teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had recognized her potential despite their family's financial struggles. Mrs. Rodriguez had worked extra hours to give Lucia lessons even when they couldn't pay, and had given her the violin as a parting gift when they had to move. Music doesn't care about money, Mrs. Rodriguez had told her. It only cares about the heart and soul you put into it. But now, faced with the prospect of performing for teachers who expected her to fail, Lucia wondered if heart and soul would be enough. She could play well, she knew that. But could she play well enough to change their minds? And more importantly, did she want to give them the satisfaction of proving their assumptions right if something went wrong? The next few days at school were torture. Teachers continued to mention her upcoming performance in ways that felt more like reminders of an approaching execution. Students whispered about it in the hallways, some expressing excitement about witnessing what they expected to be a spectacular failure. Mrs. Henderson made several more public comments about the event, each one carefully designed to increase the pressure on Lucia. I do hope you're practicing, dear, she said during music class. We want to make sure you're properly prepared for such an important audience. Have you chosen what piece you'll be performing? She asked another day. Somebody. Hing appropriate for your skill level, I hope. Each comment was accompanied by that same artificially sweet smile and delivered just loudly enough for other students to hear. By Wednesday evening, Lucia was a bundle of nerves. She had been practicing every night, but her hands kept shaking whenever she thought about the audience waiting for her to fail. Diego noticed his daughter's distress, though he didn't understand its cause. Are you feeling all right, mija? He asked during dinner. You seem worried about something. Lucia pushed food around her plate, struggling with whether to tell him the truth. Finally, she decided he deserved to know. Papa, I have to play violin for all my teachers tomorrow after school, she said quietly. Diego's face immediately brightened with pride. That's wonderful. They must have recognized your talent. I'm so proud of you. His genuine excitement made Lucia's heart ache. She couldn't bring herself to explain that this wasn't recognition. It was punishment for daring to claim she had abilities beyond what they expected from someone like her. "Will you be able to come watch?" she asked, though part of her hoped he would be too busy. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," Diego said firmly. "I'll ask Mrs. Johnson if I can adjust my schedule slightly. This is a big moment for you." That night, Lucia lay awake staring at the ceiling, knowing that tomorrow would change everything. Either she would prove herself and potentially earn the respect she deserved, or she would fail publicly and confirm every negative assumption the teachers had made about her. The violin case seemed to glow in the moonlight streaming through her window, holding both her greatest hope and her deepest fear. Thursday arrived with gray clouds hanging low over Lincoln Elementary, matching the heavy feeling in Lucia's chest. She had barely touched her breakfast, and Diego noticed her picking at her food with obvious concern. "Are you nervous about your performance today?" he asked gently, sitting down across from her at their small kitchen table. Lucia nodded, not trusting her voice. How could she explain that she wasn't just nervous, she was terrified? Not of playing the violin, but of the judgment that would follow regardless of how well she performed. "Remember what I always tell you," Diego said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "You are just as good as anyone else, mija. Don't let anyone make you feel small." His words were meant to comfort her, but they only made her feel worse. Diego still believed this was an honor, a chance for his daughter to shine. He had no idea it was designed to be her public humiliation. At school, the day dragged by with agonizing slowness. During each class, Lucia caught teachers exchanging meaningful glances and whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the room. Word had spread throughout the faculty about the afternoon's entertainment, and she could feel their anticipation building. Mrs. Henderson seemed particularly energetic, humming to herself and making elaborate preparations in the music room. During lunch, she approached Lucia's table with an announcement that made several nearby students stop eating to listen. "Just wanted to remind you about this afternoon, dear," she said with exaggerated enthusiasm. "I've set up a lovely performance area in the faculty lounge. We'll have wonderful acoustics there." Rose looked up from her sandwich with a worried expression. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she whispered after Mrs. Henderson had walked away. "You seem really scared." Lucia stared down at her untouched food. "I don't think I have a choice anymore." "You could always say you're sick," Rose suggested hopefully, "or that you forgot your violin at home." But Lucia shook her head. Running away would only confirm their assumptions and make things worse. Besides, her father was planning to attend, and she couldn't bear the thought of disappointing him. The afternoon classes seemed to crawl by at half speed. During English, Mrs. Patterson made a point of mentioning the upcoming musical showcase to the entire class, her tone suggesting it would be quite a spectacle. In science, Mr. Brooks casually mentioned how important it was for students to be honest about their abilities. Each comment felt like another weight added to Lucia's shoulders. When the final bell rang, most students rushed toward the buses or their parents' cars, eager to start their weekend. But Lucia walked slowly toward the faculty lounge, carrying her violin case with hands that trembled slightly. The hallways were quieter now, with only a few teachers and staff members remaining in the building. Through classroom windows, she could see Diego setting up his cleaning supplies, preparing for his evening shift. He caught sight of her and gave her an encouraging wave and thumbs up. The faculty lounge had been transformed into a makeshift performance venue. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle facing a small cleared area near the windows. Mrs. Henderson bustled around, making final adjustments, her excitement barely contained. Teachers began filtering in, many carrying coffee cups or remaining snacks from their afternoon break. The atmosphere felt more like a social gathering than a serious musical performance, which made Lucia's stomach churn even more. Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Brooks took seats in the front row, whispering to each other and occasionally glancing toward the door where Lucia stood hesitating. Mrs. Chen arrived with her phone in hand, clearly prepared to document the event. Principal Johnson entered with several parent volunteers, the same ones Mrs. Henderson had mentioned earlier in the week. Mrs. Williams from the PTA looked curious but kind, while Mr. Garcia seemed more skeptical, his arms crossed as he found a seat. "Ah, there's our star performer," Mrs. Henderson announced loudly as she noticed Lucia in the doorway. Come in. We're all so excited to hear you play." Every conversation in the room stopped as all eyes turned toward Lucia. The silence felt crushing, filled with expectations and doubt in equal measure. She could practically feel the disbelief radiating from most of the adults in the room. Diego appeared in the doorway behind her, having finished his initial setup for the evening. He had changed into a clean shirt and combed his hair neatly, clearly wanting to look his best for his daughter's big moment. "Sorry I'm a little late," Diego said quietly to Principal Johnson. "Thank you for letting me adjust my schedule to be here." Principal Johnson nodded politely, though Lucia noticed how the principal's demeanor became slightly more formal when addressing her father. Even the principal seemed to view this as some kind of lesson rather than a genuine showcase of talent. Mrs. Henderson clapped her hands together to get everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have such a treat today. One of our newest students, Lucia Rivera, has told us she's been playing violin for 4 years. We thought it would be wonderful to give her a chance to share her musical gifts with all of us." The way she emphasized "told us" and "gifts" made it clear to everyone in the room that she doubted both claims. Several teachers smiled in a way that wasn't entirely kind, and Lucia felt heat rising in her cheeks. "Lucia, why don't you come up here and get ready?" Mrs. Henderson continued, gesturing toward the performance area. "Take all the time you need to prepare." Walking to the front of the room felt like walking to her execution. Every step seemed to echo in the sudden silence, and she could feel dozens of eyes following her movement. Her violin case felt heavier than usual, as if it contained not just an instrument but all of her hopes and fears. Diego found a seat near the back of the room, his face glowing with pride and encouragement. He was the only person in the room who seemed to genuinely believe in her, and that realization both comforted and terrified her. Lucia set her case down on a nearby table and opened it with fingers that shook slightly. The violin inside was old but well-maintained, its wood polished to a warm glow despite several small scratches that spoke of years of use. It wasn't fancy or expensive, but it had been her constant companion through all the challenges of the past few years. The room remained silent as she lifted the violin from its case, though she could hear a few whispered comments from the audience. "Look at that old thing," someone murmured. "Poor kid probably got it from a pawn shop," another voice said quietly. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward with an expression of forced patience. "Whenever you're ready, dear. We know this might be challenging for you." Lucia carefully positioned the violin under her chin, testing the weight and feel that had become as familiar as breathing. She picked up the bow and checked its tension, making small adjustments with practiced movements that seemed automatic. For a moment, she closed her eyes and tried to block out the audience. The whispers, the expectations of failure. She thought about Mrs. Rodriguez, her first teacher, who had seen something special in a shy girl from a struggling family. She thought about all the hours she had practiced in their cramped apartment, playing softly so as not to disturb the neighbors. Most importantly, she thought about the music itself, the way it could transport her to a world where none of the other stuff mattered, where she wasn't the janitor's daughter or the new kid or the girl with second-hand clothes, where she was just Lucia, expressing herself through something beautiful. She opened her eyes and looked out at the sea of skeptical faces. In the back, Diego sat forward in his chair, his hands clasped together and his expression full of love and faith in his daughter. Taking a deep breath, Lucia raised the bow to the strings. The first note that emerged from the violin was pure and clear, cutting through the silence like a blade. It was immediately obvious that this wasn't the screeching sound everyone had been expecting. Instead, it was the beginning of Bach's Air on the G string, one of the most beautiful and technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire. The effect on the room was immediate and dramatic. The smug expressions on several teachers' faces froze mid-smirk. Whispered conversations stopped abruptly. Even the parent volunteers who had come expecting to witness a child's embarrassing failure sat up straighter in their chairs. As Lucia's fingers began to dance across the fingerboard, weaving the complex melody with precision and emotion, the silence in the room became profound. This wasn't just competent playing. This was genuinely skilled musicianship from someone who clearly understood both the technical and emotional aspects of the piece. Mrs. Henderson's mouth fell open slightly, her carefully planned humiliation backfiring spectacularly. Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Brooks exchanged shocked glances, their whispered predictions of failure now seeming cruel and foolish. The music filled every corner of the faculty lounge, transforming the space from a place of judgment into something approaching sacred. Lucia's technique was flawless, her intonation perfect, and her interpretation of the piece showed a maturity that belied her young age. But more than technical skill, there was something else in her playing, a depth of emotion that spoke of real experience with hardship and hope. Every note carried the weight of her struggles and the strength she had found in music during difficult times. As the piece progressed, the atmosphere in the room shifted completely. The adults who had come to witness a child's failure found themselves witnessing something extraordinary instead. Some of the parent volunteers had tears in their eyes, moved by both the beauty of the performance and the realization of what they had almost missed. Diego sat in the back with tears streaming down his face, finally understanding why his daughter had been so nervous. She hadn't been afraid of playing badly. She had been afraid of playing well for people who didn't think she deserved to. When Lucia drew the final note from the strings, letting it hang in the air before slowly lowering her bow, the silence that followed was completely different from the expectant quiet that had preceded her performance. This was the stunned silence of people who had just witnessed something that challenged everything they thought they knew. The applause, when it finally came, was hesitant at first but quickly grew into something genuine and appreciative. Even Mrs. Henderson found herself clapping, though her face burned with shame at what she had tried to orchestrate. Lucia stood holding her violin, looking out at the transformed faces in the audience. The doubt and skepticism had been replaced by surprise, respect, and in some cases, deep embarrassment at their own assumptions. Principal Johnson was the first to speak, his voice carrying a note of authority that silenced the remaining whispers. "That was absolutely extraordinary, Lucia," he said, rising from his chair. "Where did you learn to play like that?" The question hung in the air, and Lucia realized that this moment would determine not just how they saw her, but how they understood the assumptions they had made about her family and background. Looking back at her father's proud face, she found her voice and prepared to tell them exactly how wrong they had been about everything. The silence in the faculty lounge stretched for what felt like an eternity. Lucia stood holding her violin, looking out at faces that had been completely transformed by her performance. Where skepticism and smug anticipation had been moments before, there was now shock, embarrassment, and genuine awe. Principal Johnson's question hung in the air. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Lucia glanced back at her father, whose face was still wet with tears of pride and pain. Diego had heard the principal's tone of surprise and was beginning to understand that this hadn't been the honor he thought it was. "I started learning when I was 6, Lucia said quietly, her voice barely carrying across the room. "My teacher was Mrs. Rodriguez at the community center in our old neighborhood." She paused, carefully placing her violin back in its case while the adults waited for her to continue. Her hands were steadier now than they had been before the performance, as if the music had given her strength. "Mrs. Rodriguez said I had natural ability," Lucia continued, her voice growing slightly stronger. "She gave me lessons even when we couldn't always pay for them. She said music was too important to let money get in the way." Mrs. Henderson shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her face flushed with shame. Several other teachers were staring at their hands, unable to meet Lucia's eyes. "We had to move when Papa lost his job at the factory," Lucia explained, her tone matter-of-fact rather than seeking sympathy. "Mrs. Rodriguez gave me this violin as a going-away present. She said I should never stop playing no matter what happened." Mr. Garcia, one of the parent volunteers, leaned forward in his chair. "How have you been practicing? Do you take lessons here in town?" Lucia shook her head. "We can't afford lessons right now. I practice at home every night after homework. I use videos on the library computers and books I check out to learn new pieces." The admission hit the room like a physical blow. Here was a child who had been teaching herself advanced classical music using library resources, practicing in a small apartment so as not to disturb neighbors, maintaining and improving her skills through pure determination and love of music, and they had assumed she was lying because her father cleaned buildings for a living. Diego stood up slowly from his seat in the back of the room. His work clothes and humble demeanor suddenly seemed to highlight the magnificent injustice of what had just occurred. "Excuse me," Diego said, his voice quiet, but carrying clearly through the room. "I need to understand something. Was this meant to embarrass my daughter?" The directness of his question caused several teachers to flinch. Principal Johnson looked around the room, clearly trying to assess the situation and figure out how to respond. Mrs. Henderson finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. You thought what? Diego asked, stepping closer to the front of the room. His tone wasn't angry, but there was steel underneath the quiet words. You thought that because I clean your school, my daughter must be a liar? The accusation hung in the air like a condemnation. Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Brooks exchanged mortified glances, while Mrs. Chen had put her phone away, clearly no longer interested in documenting the event. Mrs. Williams, the PTA representative, spoke up with obvious distress in her voice. Mr. Rivera, I don't think anyone meant to what?
Diego interrupted gently.
To assume that my daughter wasn't good enough to have real talent? To set her up to fail in front of all of you? He looked around the room, his gaze settling on each of the teachers who had orchestrated this humiliation. I work hard to provide for my daughter. I clean your classrooms and empty your trash cans because it's honest work that lets me support my family. But I also read to her every night. I help her with homework. I encourage her dreams. His voice grew stronger as he continued. Lucia practices violin for 2 hours every evening. She studies music theory from library books. She listens to classical recordings on headphones so old they're held together with tape. But she listens because she loves music more than anything else in the world. The adults in the room seemed to shrink into their chairs as Diego's words painted a picture of dedication and sacrifice they had never bothered to imagine. You see a janitor's daughter and assume she must be dishonest about her abilities, Diego continued. But I see a little girl who dreams of playing in symphony orchestras, who saves her allowance to buy rosin for her bow, who cries when she thinks a piece is too hard but keeps practicing until she masters it. Lucia watched her father defend her with a mixture of love and heartbreak. She had never heard him speak so forcefully before, and she realized he was drawing on years of quiet dignity in the face of assumptions and dismissals. Principal Johnson cleared his throat, his face grave as he began to understand the full scope of what had happened. Mr. Rivera, he said carefully, I think there may have been some misunderstandings about the nature of this performance. Misunderstandings, Diego repeated. My daughter came home terrified for 3 days. She barely ate, barely slept. I thought she was nervous about performing for important people who would appreciate her talent. He gestured toward the teachers who had organized the event. Now I see she was afraid because she knew you expected her to fail. She knew you brought her here to prove she was a liar. Mrs. Henderson finally managed to speak, though her voice was shaky. We never meant, that is, we just thought. You thought wrong, Diego said simply, about both of us. The room fell silent again as the full weight of their prejudice became clear. These educators, who preached about giving every child a fair chance, had judged a student based entirely on her father's occupation and their family's economic circumstances. Rose's voice suddenly came from the doorway, where she had been quietly watching. Can I say something? Everyone turned to see the red-haired girl who had been Lucia's first friend at the school. Principal Johnson nodded for her to continue. Lucia never brags or shows off, Rose said, stepping into the room. She's really smart in math and science too, but she just quietly does her work. When other kids were mean about her clothes or her free lunch, she never complained or made excuses. Rose looked directly at Mrs. Henderson. She only mentioned the violin when you asked directly about musical experience. She wasn't trying to get attention. She was just answering your question honestly. The young girl's words carried more moral authority than all the adults in the room combined. Her simple observation highlighted how completely they had misjudged the situation. Mr. Brooks, who had been one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the lesson they had planned, spoke up with obvious shame in his voice. Lucia, I owe you an apology, we all do. We made assumptions that were completely unfair and wrong. Mrs. Chen nodded in agreement. Your performance was extraordinary. You have genuine talent, and we should have recognized that instead of doubting you. But Lucia looked around the room with an expression that was older than her years. You didn't doubt my talent, she said quietly. You doubted me. You thought I was the kind of person who would lie to make myself seem more important. The distinction hit everyone in the room like a physical blow. She was right. This hadn't really been about musical ability at all. It had been about their assumptions regarding her character, her integrity, and her worth as a person. Principal Johnson stood up, his expression serious. You're absolutely right, Lucia. And that's completely unacceptable. He looked around the room at his faculty members. We pride ourselves on creating an inclusive environment where every student can succeed. Today we failed that mission completely. Mrs. Henderson was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks as she realized the cruelty of what she had orchestrated. Lucia, I'm so sorry. I don't know how to make this right. Lucia carefully closed her violin case, the click of the latches unnaturally loud in the quiet room. When she looked up, her eyes were clear and determined. You can start by not doing this to other kids, she said simply. Just because someone's family doesn't have money doesn't mean they don't have gifts. She picked up her case and walked toward her father. And you can remember that being poor doesn't make someone dishonest. We might not have much, but we have integrity. Diego put his arm around his daughter's shoulders, both of them preparing to leave the room that had been designed for her humiliation, but had instead revealed the character flaws of the adults who were supposed to nurture and protect her. Wait, Principal Johnson called out as they reached the door. Please, we need to discuss how to move forward from this. Diego and Lucia paused, looking back at the room full of ashamed educators and community members who were finally beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. What happens next? Diego said quietly. Depends entirely on whether you learned anything from what just occurred here. As father and daughter left the faculty lounge together, the adults remained behind to confront the uncomfortable truth about their own prejudices and the damage they had nearly caused to a remarkable young person who deserved so much better from the people entrusted with her education. The weekend following Lucia's performance was unlike anything Lincoln Elementary had experienced in recent memory. Word of what had happened in the faculty lounge spread through the community like wildfire, carried by the parent volunteers who had witnessed both the extraordinary musical performance and the shameful circumstances that had led to it. Mrs. Williams, from the PTA, made several phone calls that evening, her voice tight with anger as she described the scene to other parents. You should have heard this child play, she kept saying. It was absolutely beautiful, and those teachers set her up to fail just because her father works as a janitor. Mr. Garcia, who ran the fundraising committee, found himself unable to sleep that night. He kept thinking about Lucia's quiet dignity and her father's powerful words about assumption and prejudice. By Sunday morning, he had made a decision that would change everything. Principal Johnson spent his weekend in his office, reviewing school policies and making phone calls to the district administration. The implications of what had occurred were serious, and he knew that swift action was needed to address both the immediate harm and the systemic issues it had revealed. On Monday morning, Mrs. Henderson arrived at school to find a formal letter in her mailbox requesting her presence at a meeting with Principal Johnson and the district supervisor. Her hands shook as she read the official language describing inappropriate conduct and discriminatory behavior toward a student. The other teachers involved received similar letters. Mrs. Patterson sat in her empty classroom before the first bell, staring at the notice and wondering how she had let herself participate in something so cruel. Mr. Brooks paced his room, practicing apologies that all seemed inadequate for what they had done, but the most significant changes were happening outside the administrative offices. Rose had spent her weekend thinking about her friend's experience, and she arrived at school on Monday with a determination that surprised even her. During morning announcements, she asked to speak to her class about what had happened. Some of you heard about Lucia's violin performance last week, Rose said, standing in front of her classmates. But what you might not know is that some adults in this school tried to embarrass her because they didn't believe someone like her could have real talent. The classroom fell silent as Rose continued. Lucia is one of the smartest, most talented people I know. But some people judged her based on what her father does for work instead of who she really is. That's not fair, and it's not right. Her words resonated through the student body in ways the adults hadn't anticipated. Children began talking about their own experiences with unfair assumptions, and many started paying more attention to how they treated classmates from different backgrounds. Meanwhile, Mr. Garcia had been busy making phone calls of his own. As a successful business owner who had grown up in a working-class family, he understood both sides of the economic divide that had created this situation. By Wednesday, he had organized an emergency meeting of the school's parent council. The meeting was packed, with standing room only as parents and community members. gathered to discuss what had happened and how to prevent it from recurring. We have a talented young musician in our school who was nearly driven away by prejudice and ignorance. Mr. Garcia addressed the crowd. But more than that, we have a systemic problem with how we view and treat families who work in service positions. The response was immediate and powerful. Parents began sharing their own stories of assumptions and bias they had witnessed or experienced. A fund was established that very evening to ensure that no student would be denied opportunities due to financial constraints. But perhaps most importantly, Mrs. Rodriguez received an unexpected phone call on Thursday evening. "Mrs. Rodriguez, this is Mr. Garcia from Lincoln Elementary. I'm calling about one of your former students, Lucia Rivera." The retired music teacher's voice immediately filled with concern. "Is Lucia all right? Is she still playing?" "She's more than all right," Mr. Garcia explained. "She's extraordinary. But we need your help to make sure she gets the opportunities she deserves." Within a week, Mrs. Rodriguez had been hired as a part-time music instructor at Lincoln Elementary, specifically to work with talented students who needed additional support. Her first official student would be Lucia, with lessons funded by the newly established scholarship program. The changes weren't limited to music education. Principal Johnson implemented new training requirements for all staff members, focusing on unconscious bias and the importance of high expectations for every student. Mrs. Henderson, Mrs. Patterson, and Mr. Brooks were required to complete additional sensitivity training and community service hours at local organizations, serving low-income families. But the most profound change was in the daily culture of the school itself. Diego found that other staff members began greeting him differently as he went about his evening cleaning duties. Teachers who had barely acknowledged him before now stopped to ask about Lucia's progress and to share genuine appreciation for his work in keeping the school clean and safe. "Mr. Rivera," Mrs. Chen approached him one evening as he was mopping the art room floor. "I wanted to apologize again for what happened, and I wanted you to know that your daughter helped me finish a science project I was struggling with. She's incredibly bright." These small interactions began to add up, creating a new atmosphere where Diego felt seen and respected as a full member of the school community rather than invisible help. For Lucia herself, the weeks following her performance brought changes she had never dared to hope for. Her fellow students, initially curious about the drama surrounding her performance, quickly became genuinely interested in her musical abilities. Several asked if they could hear her play again, this time out of authentic appreciation rather than skeptical curiosity. The school orchestra, which had seemed impossibly out of reach when she first arrived, welcomed her as their youngest member. During her first rehearsal, the high school students who made up most of the group were initially skeptical about including an elementary student. But when Lucia played her audition piece, the same Bach composition that had stunned the faculty, their attitudes changed immediately. "Can you teach me that fingering technique you used in the third measure?" asked Katie, the senior who served as concertmaster. "I've been struggling with that passage for months." Rose remained her closest friend, but Lucia found her social circle expanding as other students began to see past their initial assumptions. The girl who had once eaten lunch alone was now surrounded by classmates, eager to hear about her musical experiences and practice sessions. The spring concert became the most anticipated event in the school's recent history. Word had spread throughout the community about the talented young violinist, and tickets sold out within hours of being made available. On the night of the performance, the school auditorium was packed with families, community members, and even some people from neighboring towns who had heard about Lucia's story. Diego sat in the front row wearing his best shirt, his face glowing with pride as he watched other parents and community members treat him with genuine respect and interest. When Lucia took the stage for her solo performance, the silence was immediate and complete. But this time it was the respectful quiet of an audience preparing to appreciate something beautiful, not the expectant hush of people waiting for failure. She played Vivaldi's Spring from the Four Seasons, her interpretation filled with the joy and hope of someone who had overcome significant challenges to reach this moment. The music soared through the auditorium, touching hearts and changing minds with every note. The standing ovation that followed was thunderous and genuine, a celebration not just of musical talent but of the triumph of potential over prejudice. Mrs. Henderson, who had been dreading this moment for weeks, found herself crying tears of genuine appreciation rather than shame. She had learned more about teaching, compassion, and the danger of assumptions in the past month than in all her previous years of education. After the concert, as families gathered in the lobby for refreshments and congratulations, something remarkable happened. Diego found himself surrounded by other parents who wanted to share their appreciation, not just for his daughter's talent, but for the lesson their family had taught the entire community. "Thank you," Mrs. Williams said, shaking his hand warmly. "Lucia's courage and your dignity have made all of us better people." Mr. Garcia approached with news that would change their lives again. "I've been in contact with the State University's music program," he said. "They have a summer camp for gifted young musicians, and they'd like to offer Lucia a full scholarship." But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Mrs. Rodriguez, who had driven 2 hours to attend the concert, embraced both Lucia and Diego with tears in her eyes. "I always knew you were special," she told Lucia, "but I never imagined you would touch so many lives with your music." As the evening wound down and families began heading home, Lucia stood on the stage one final time, holding her violin case and looking out at the now empty auditorium. The space that had once seemed so intimidating now felt like home. Rose joined her on stage, both girls reflecting on how much had changed since that first difficult day when Lucia had arrived as the janitor's daughter. "Are you happy we moved here?" Rose asked. Lucia considered the question seriously. The journey had been difficult, marked by prejudice and assumptions that could have broken her spirit. But it had also led to growth, change, and opportunities that might never have existed otherwise. "Yes," she said finally. "It was hard, but it was worth it. Sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most challenging pieces." As they walked toward the lobby where Diego was waiting to drive them home, Lucia reflected on everything she had learned. Music had always been her refuge and her passion, but now she understood it could also be a bridge, connecting people across differences in background, economics, and assumptions. The girl who had once hidden her talents to avoid disappointment was now inspiring an entire community to examine their biases and expand their definition of potential. Her story had become more than just one student's triumph. It had become a catalyst for positive change that would benefit countless others who followed in her footsteps. And in the parking lot, as Diego helped her carefully place her violin in the back seat of their modest car, Lucia realized that she was no longer just the janitor's daughter. She was a musician, a student, a friend, and a young person whose courage had reminded an entire community that talent, determination, and character have nothing to do with economic circumstances. The drive home was quiet, but it was the comfortable silence of a family who had faced adversity together and emerged stronger. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight they could rest in the knowledge that they had changed hearts and minds simply by being authentically themselves. As they pulled into the parking lot of their small apartment complex, Lucia could see other families through windows, living their own stories of hope and struggle. She thought about all the talented children whose abilities might be overlooked because of assumptions about their backgrounds. But now, thanks to what had happened at Lincoln Elementary, there would be systems in place to recognize and nurture those talents. Scholarships would be available, teachers would be better trained, and the community would be more open to seeing potential in every child, regardless of their family's circumstances. The violin case sat safely beside her as they walked up the stairs to their apartment, ready for tomorrow's practice session and all the beautiful music yet to be discovered.